All right, so it's 2:01, so I'll get us started while people connect. So welcome everyone to this CERRE webinar, the last one, our last one before the summer, actually. So today we're here to present a paper that's looking into how retail energy markets have have coped with the crisis, the energy crisis so far across Europe. And we're trying to draw some initial conclusions and reflections, at least from this analysis. So just for context, so this is done as part of an ongoing CERRE research project on both wholesale and retail market design. So we're looking at both, not in isolation, but we're starting with the first paper, a pre-summer paper that's looking specifically at retail. And there will be more work coming from us on wholesale at the rentrée in September, and the long form report before the end of the year. This with the ambition to feed into the ongoing discussion around the future of market design, whether it's at wholesale or retail level. So today with us to discuss this, we've got three of the five CERRE academics that worked on this paper, and they will present in a few minutes. So you've got Michael Pollitt, Bert Willems, and Chloé Le Coq, who'll speak in a bit. And then this presentation will be followed by a discussion with representatives from regulators, civil society, corporates, and policymakers. So expect a 20-minute presentation followed by an hour discussion with this panel, in which the academics will also obviously participate. So yeah, we've got a good crowded group, but we'll aim to take questions from the audience if time allows. We'll really try to do so. So if you have questions for the presenters or the participants, please drop them in the Q&A section. And I'll let the academics present the paper now, and then I'll introduce our panel after the presentation. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. It's Michael Pollitt here. And so I'm going to kick us off. And I wanted to start by thanking all of my colleagues for their contributions to this, and particularly to Nils-Henrik van der Fehr, who did lead the paper, but unfortunately is not well enough to present today. So I'm delighted to have Chloé and Bert presenting alongside of me. Albéric has mentioned that this paper that we're presenting today is part of an ongoing project looking at the energy crisis in Europe. What we're presenting today is a short paper on retail market design. We're going to prepare a similar paper on wholesale market design in Europe. And then we will be producing a fuller report on both wholesale and retail market design later in the year, which will include the latest updates and some of the feedback that we've received along the way. Next slide, please. So today's report focuses on retail, and the retail part of the project is asking the rather obvious question: how well have European retail electricity markets been coping with the current energy crisis? With, of course, some implications for gas markets as well. Short-term measures that have been taken by governments to impact high energy prices, how good have those been? We wanted to ask that question. We want to ask the question of what long-term measures can governments take to protect consumers over the long run, and perhaps in response to future crises like this one. An important question which arises whenever you do a project like this at the European level is, what's the role of the EU or European institutions versus individual member states or individual countries across Europe? Do electricity and gas directives help or hinder national responses, which may be maybe legitimate given national preferences around retail. And an important question which arises from the crisis is the extent to which the risk exposure of energy retailers needs to be regulated. And if we're going to regulate risk exposure, what are the options for doing that? These are the high-level questions that we want to answer in the full report. And we've produced this short paper which begins to answer some of these questions, particularly focusing on what's happened in a number of countries in Europe and lessons from what these countries have actually been doing. And next slide, please. So just to reiterate that this paper is now published on our website, this short paper. I do recommend it. It's not actually that short. It turned out that writing a short paper about retail is actually pretty difficult. So it's actually 50 pages, but it is quite detailed, quite up to date and very interesting. And we've got 4 country case studies in there, of which we'll present 3 now. The ones on France, the Netherlands, and Great Britain, but there's also a case study on Norway. And in the paper that we'll do in later in the year, we plan to include further country case studies, and some of which are already being written. In addition to the individual case studies, we focus on the lessons that might be learned overall and outstanding challenges and opportunities raised by the retail crisis. And without further ado, I'll hand on to Chloé to talk about the French case study.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so in France, it's fair to say that the current energy crisis has had a limited impact on the retail market in general, or the energy retail market, and this is mainly due to the tariff shell implemented last October. So if we first focused on the retail electricity market, obviously the government response was to freeze the regulated tariff, and first, by doing this, by setting a cap on this regulated tariff, allowing for an increase of 4% only for the whole 2022. The second measure was to remove the electricity consumption tax. And finally, and the heavy debated measure was for the government to extend the EDF, the incumbent obligation to sell nuclear energy as at a fixed price to an alternative supplier. So I think this last measure is quite important and quite special to the French case, in the sense that because you want to introduce or make sure you have competition between alternative supplier and the incumbent EDF, there was this mechanism that was in place where actually alternative supplier could buy, who had the option to buy at a fixed price a volume of nuclear energy produced by EDF. And that was just an option. And as you see in this graph that I put here, you know, obviously, if the price on the wholesale price is less than the fixed price, which was 42 euro per megawatt, then obviously, as a retailer, you will not exercise this option, and you will buy all your energy on the wholesale market. And this is typically what happened, especially in 2016, when no one requested this volume, but also 2015, there was really little to request. Now, when the wholesale price is starting to pick, then obviously you exercise this option. And indeed, everyone, almost all alternative suppliers started to ask or to exercise this option. This ended up being, so there was this limit, this volume, this cap on 100. And obviously this limit was switched, and then there was a push for the government to push up this limit and increase this limit, so to make sure that alternative supplier could buy cheap electricity price to resell it. Next slide, please. So what is interesting with this third measure is also that it means regarding to what Michael was saying on the risk exposure of retailer, when you introduce this measure, EDF is bearing at least some of the cost of that usually in other countries are faced by the retailer, because they're taking on some risk related to the price variability. So for the case of the electricity market, retail market, one can say that yes, there was some impact and there was some limit to the increase in electricity price, and indeed you have somehow 23 million of French households that benefit from this reduced price increase. And what you observe in the market is like really few bankruptcies. So to some extent, retailer were not really impacted by this price increase. But this policy also comes at a cost, not only because you have missing tax revenue, but also because, like in any price control, the price signal is distorted, so you have less demand response or none. And then, but it's also a concern that this policy will restrict EDF nuclear investment strategy and slow down the energy transition, right? So this energy crisis has limited impact, I will say, on the short term. On the long term, we don't know yet. And a final word on what's going on in the retail gas sector, but it is also interesting to compare with the electricity market. What is here is, so to some extent, you have the same market structure. You have one incumbent in G, and then you have alternative supplier that are also important. And then you have also some shell frozen tariff. However, what you observe here is that you had no obligation for energy to sell, and you have no tax deduction. And on top of that, in this market, in the gas market, you have half of the consumer are on fixed price contract, which means that, and it could be really long contract, 3 or 4 years. So which means that there is no impact for them on this huge price increase. So relative to the electricity market, what's going on in the retail electricity market, you want to say that you should expect less price distortion and the relatively same level of competition between supplier and incumbent in the gas sector. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. So I will say something about the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, we don't have regulated contracts with price cap as in France. And what we can see is that the Dutch retail market design has been relatively resilient during the crisis, but the consumers have borne most of the high energy prices. So we see that there has been some bankruptcies. So 6 retailers went bankrupt, but those were really small startups. So they covered only 2% of the households. So this wasn't really seen as a big problem. There were no supply interruptions, but those households, they were randomly allocated to some of the existing suppliers, and they were shifted to a market confirmed rate. So those consumers that had to switch, they were hurt. So we also see that the liquidity of the retail market was drying up. So the comparison websites that would no longer show contracts, or that would only show variable price contracts and long-term price with fixed price contracts are no longer offered by the retailer. So this means that more and more consumers had to switch to, or were automatically at the end of their contract switching to a variable price contract, and they're now fully exposed to the wholesale price. And the reason why this liquidity dried up is partially due to a regulation that limit the penalty for early termination, which makes it too risky for retailers to offer a long-term fixed price contract, because once prices reduce, they would switch to a retailer who was offering lower prices. So what has been a concern, so next slide, please, for the government is affordability of energy. And the government has gone for a direct income support scheme for the poorest households. So local governments were given some budget that they could address for the 10% poorest households, and this was about €800 per year. And then there was also general tax credit on the income tax payments worth about 260 euros. So you see that those income support schemes, they kept incentives contact, so people were still paying the high price, but they got a direct income subsidy. What's also interesting is that there used to be an energy tax that was earmarked for supporting renewable energy sources, but because the energy price or the wholesale price was that high, there was no need anymore to give those extra subsidies for renewable energy sources, so that could then be reduced from the retail bill. And then the last measure is also reduction of the VAT tax. So that's going on from July onwards, and that's also an additional support scheme. So next to that, there has been some discussion about whether there should be an adjustment of regulation. So both the regulator and legislators have the opinion that the regulation of suppliers' risk-taking should be improved, but it's not completely clear yet in which direction or how far they want to go, because they say that it might be useful to have some bankruptcies. If you have a good functioning market, there might be new firms that enter the market, and some firms are expected to go bankrupt if they don't have a good business model. So that's sort of a downside there that they're considering. And the second possible regulation is the introduction of a guarantee fund that would compensate consumers of bankrupt suppliers so that they could keep with their existing contract. But here also there is some discussion whether this would be a good measure, because it reduces the incentive for consumers to actually go for a high quality retailer. Okay, so Michael, I think next.
Thanks, Bert. So on to Great Britain. The retail energy crisis has been profound. We've gone from 52 retail companies to 23. So that's 29 bankruptcies since July 2021. And that's been mainly a result of the interaction of a lagging price cap. So we have a safeguard price cap on retail electricity and gas prices in the UK, which is reset every 6 months. That's been rising since the 1st of October 2021, and it's risen again on the 1st of April 2022, expected to rise again on the 1st of October 2022. So it's been, the underlying price cap has been going up, but of course costs have been going up faster than that. That's meant that as customers have defaulted onto the price cap, the suppliers are not getting enough money from the price cap to cover the costs that they're actually incurring in the market. So that's been a major reason why there have been bankruptcies, in addition to the lack of long-term hedging that the bankrupt retailers were generally engaged in, because most of them didn't have their own generation, but were relying on buying electricity in often monthly contract markets and selling contracts which lasted for a year. So one of the questions that this interaction effect raises is, how often should the price cap be reset? And we're certainly talking about now shortening the price cap reset to 3 months to not have this effect in the future. There's also been questions raised about financial regulation, the bankruptcy regime, because the costs of the bankruptcy of customers who have been with bankrupt firms, which is about 4 million customers out of 28 million or so, that's been generally socialized across all customers, though some of it was so extreme it did go to the taxpayer. The lack of hedging of suppliers is something that needs to be looked at. Next slide, please. On the plus side, if there is a plus side from a sort of economic point of view, in general, good economic advice has been followed to maintain the price signal and to target the income distribution effects of much higher prices. Direct targeted financial support amounts to about £1,200 per household for at least 25% of households. And that was going to cover the expected bill rise from 1st of October 2021 to the bill rise that was expected at the time of the final package of support measures announcement, the bill rise that was expected to come on the 1st of October 2022. Since then, underlying costs have risen yet again, perhaps by another £400, and there have been expectation that that support measures will have to be increased. The fact that the underlying prices have been going up, even though most people are on the default tariffs, has created strong incentives for energy efficiency and, in the long run, investment in renewables. I'm certainly putting my solar panels on my roof as fast as I can now. And of course, it's early days to tell what the demand effect has been, but the latest monthly figures for April 2022 show electricity demand down 17% on April a year ago, and gas demand down 20% on April a year ago. Now, of course, maybe underlying weather correction factors there, but certainly strong indications that there is going to be a very big demand effect as a result of these substantial price rises. I think there is a question mark about how quickly we'll ever return to a competitive market in the UK for households, which has been raised by Stephen Littlechild, given the sort of mission creep effect of the initial introduction of a safeguard tariff, which has now going to prove difficult to remove. The interaction between the safeguard price cap and the underlying costs has effectively ended retail competition. And as Bert has just said, if you go on a price comparison website now, there are a few offers, but in general, the price comparison website recommends you stay on the safeguard tariff that you're on at the moment and don't switch. So effectively, yes, you can switch to another offer, but you're not being recommended to. Next slide, please. So in the paper, you'll read about the lessons that we draw from the case studies and our general observations on the retail crisis. Not surprisingly, it appears that regulators were generally unprepared for such a large rise in underlying gas and electricity prices, that certainly unintegrated suppliers who didn't have their own generation didn't have sufficient hedging and long-term contracting. And this, was detrimental for consumers where consumers were exposed to that. The regulators don't seem to have done sufficient stress testing on what the implications of large underlying rises in prices, wholesale prices, might have been. There have been a lot of market interventions, as we've heard. Certainly, the French example is a good one, and some of the interaction between the price cap and the bankruptcy regime in other countries. And in general, those regulatory interventions have been detrimental to efficiency and to the long-term financial viability of the electricity and gas sectors. Yeah, and there's a sort of a long-run cost implication to some of these things, that clearly the putting off of paying for costs into the future for the countries that we look at for certain elements of costs. Next slide, please. So what are some of the ongoing challenges and opportunities to reshape the retail market? Clearly, large rise in prices should facilitate behavioral change where it is passed on to consumers. And, we know that fossil fuel-based energy is too cheap because it doesn't reflect a sufficiently high price of carbon. So, high unit energy prices based on fossil fuels is something that needs to happen across the economy. And to the extent that this can bring this forward, it should improve energy efficiency and promote the energy transition, albeit one wouldn't have recommended introducing it all in one go. Energy prices somehow have to reflect actual costs of renewable energy. So consumers have paid for some cheaper energy, both renewable energy and some nuclear energy, and that they should somehow get a benefit from that, and we need to work out how we can incorporate that into retail pricing. Clearly, different countries, as we've just heard, have done different things. What's happened in France versus what's happened in the Netherlands versus what's happened in the UK is very, very different and reflects national preferences to some extent over prices and the degree of intervention that might be acceptable. We can all agree that stricter requirements are required on the financial position of suppliers. Poorly capitalized new entrants into retail energy have performed pretty poorly in the crisis, and questions are certainly raised about the extent to which they should have been better regulated in line with some of the lessons from the financial crisis, which must have parallels in this energy crisis. Thinking about how you can support vulnerable and poor consumers and just the general macroeconomic shock of high energy prices through consumer support schemes. Clearly, there's been lots of experimentation, different types of intervention across European countries, which our case studies illustrate, and there must be some good lessons there about what's a better type of intervention and what's a worse type of intervention, or what's more appropriate in certain countries rather than others. Certainly hedging risk and to encourage flexible demand and energy conservation is a challenge. Yes, of course, we can sign long-term contracts for energy and fixed prices for many years, but that blunts demand flexibility, and how we can combine the two is important. And, should there be any European-wide or single market-wide limits to what member states can do to intervene in markets? Clearly it is worrying that some countries that have let prices go up are going to get huge demand response, whereas other countries are going to get very little, and that doesn't seem fair. To what extent should the Commission be encouraging a common approach or leaving intervention to individual member states? That remains an open question, which no doubt our panelists will comment on. Okay, and that's, I think, the last of our slides, and I would encourage you to read the paper. There's a lot of good up-to-date detail in there, and I certainly commend it to everyone and look forward to hearing the discussion. Back to you, Albrecht.
Thank you very much, Michael, Chloé, and Bert. And yes, we look forward to reading the paper. In the meantime, so we'll move to the panel discussion. And so starting with, we're going to give everyone a chance to react to what's been presented. So today with us, we've got, so I'm going to go by alphabetical order, starting with everyone's last name. So we've got Verdiana Ambrosi from Terna, who's the head of European regulation there. Xila Bartok, who's team leader for gas markets and energy retail at CERRE. Liam Gold, who's energy strategy and consumer affairs analyst at the Northern Irish utility regulator. Lia Kotsu, regulatory director at PPC of Greece. Jaime Lofredo, energy policy officer at BEUC. Anne Rademacher, policy officer at DG Ener, European Commission, and Andrea Villa, head of European regulation at Enel Group. So thanks a lot for joining us today. So I'm going to give everyone, as I said, 2-3 minutes to react to what's been presented and maybe to highlight some of the points, especially in the conclusions and challenges and opportunities that you think are of particular interest, or that you think are worth exploring further, and you basically give your opinion on the issue in general. And then after that, we'll take some more questions, ask you some more questions, and ideally take a few questions from the audience as well. The academic team will also react to your own reactions afterwards. But maybe we can start with Anne from DG Ener, with your initial reaction to what's been presented just now, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this interesting presentation and for the paper. I think it raised some very interesting questions. The presentation demonstrates the very large impact of the current energy crisis on the end consumer, and in particular for vulnerable consumer. But I think the presentation also shows that there is that the energy situation differs strongly among the member states. This is the case with regard to their energy mix, and some with mainly nuclear, other with a lot of renewables or hydro. The member state differs also with regard to their market structure. Some have dominant incumbents, while there is more competition in other markets. They differ also with the share of consumers that are on flexible tariffs. And as a consequence of this diversity among the member states, we see that government's response has been different as well. Some of them focusing on the high price through VAT, to voucher, to targeted scheme. Others more focusing also on mitigating the consequences of supplier bankruptcies. And I think it's difficult with such a diversity in energy market. It's difficult to design one fit all ideal support measure. The European Commission has published a toolbox already in October 2021, and a communication on the 18th of May this year. And those two documents are meant to provide a guidance to member states by listing what are the potential short-term measure as a suggestion, rather than encouraging one particular measure as such. I would like also to highlight one of your conclusions, which was the careful design of consumer support measure. I agree with that. I think with the two documents published, the Commission was not suggesting that member states should apply those measures, but rather make member states aware that those measures are at their disposal. And some of these measures should really be considered as exceptional, linked to the emergency crisis, be temporary, and follow the criteria set out in the communication. I'll probably stop here in order to leave some time for the other participants to react.
Thank you very much, Anne, and yeah, very good point on the need to tailor carefully, tailor and design carefully consumer support measures. We'll come back to this afterwards. I'll give the floor now to Xela, if you also want to react, and then we'll after you we'll go to Jaume from Milk.
Thank you, Albéric. I find the paper very interesting, and to be honest, I also kind of went into and read it last night. I find very interesting the case studies because they raise relevant questions, and especially about the schemes and what kind of balances would need to be stricken. But what is interesting in this debate is that eventually the whole crisis brings in maybe a deeper or more fundamental discussion, which is about the energy trilemma, where we would like to kind of strike a balance between sustainability, affordability, but also we have to manage security of supply issues that we are facing today. And so it's very true that the countries would react differently to it, but because also they would see differently this trilemma. And some countries are more exposed in terms of security of supply crisis, and some other countries are less exposed. And so those aspects are kind of brought into the retail debate, which is also very exciting. It's true that in itself, the schemes can eventually sort of destroy opportunities for the market, for the suppliers to react to the situation. And I think that's fundamentally, or what at CERRE we believe that would be also important, that kind of both carriages, the public support the kind of schemes that should alleviate situations where the market cannot act, and the market types of instruments would somehow act in cohesion. And I think this is very difficult because the depth of the security of supply crisis eventually hits very strongly or puts very tough affordability questions, and you also have all sorts of cascading effects which you need to manage at the same time. And that eventually is also visible in the experimentation with the public schemes, also like how the supplier of last resort schemes were kind of looked into. Maybe some of them got improved just because they were realizing that there is no proper answer to the question. And that's on the one hand. I think those could be the more sort of the better kind of directions. And then you have also not too very good reactions where it kind of the interventions were too intrusive. We're not helping eventually the suppliers to respond to the crisis. There was a milder part of the crisis, which we now, as we look back, maybe was happening in the first quarter, where eventually the gas supply was still coming to Europe, although there had to be some sort of exchange between LNG and Russian pipeline supply, until to the point when gas was more massively drying out. So here is a very important dilemma. Some of the questions probably we would kind of respond to gradually, because all the time you have the supply security aspect that you need to resolve. And then I find on the conclusions, I find very interesting eventually whether this will help us to move to a behavior change on the user end, and that would be very critical. And so when we are putting forward affordability, we are helping affordability at the same time, in particular for this kind of crisis, we should be also looking at energy savings. And I would stop here.
Thanks a lot, Xela. You rightly highlight the difficulty of finding the right balance between these different objectives. So security of supply, affordability, and demand response, and that's indeed some of the points highlighted, and where we don't have a full answer yet to this. There surely is some level of balance that can be found. Jaume, do you want to go next?
Yes, sure.
Perspective.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. Very happy to to speak here and to have the opportunity to react to the paper. Maybe I would like to share 3-4 points from the consumer perspective. And the first point, actually, linking to what Xela just said, we shouldn't forget that at the moment we might have issues with the security of supply. So I think that demand reduction is important. It's important to try to find a way to help consumers. Not only households, but also industrial consumers to save energy, because we might end up not having enough gas at the end of the winter. For as sad as it as it sounds, it's a possibility. So income support is important, especially for vulnerable consumers. Maybe it would be important to tie it to demand reduction measures, because at the end of the day, it's if you give consumers money to, for example, insulate their roofs, they will have these savings in terms of energy, in terms of savings in monetary savings in their energy bills forever. So maybe we should also look at how can we, rather than giving a voucher to consumers, giving vouchers that are linked to measures that will allow consumers to save energy. Very quickly, there are 3 points. First one, I agree with what was said in the presentation. We saw ourselves as well, suppliers going bankrupt in many countries. And this is a problem not only for the suppliers who go bankrupt, but it's a problem also for consumers because many consumers don't know of the existence of the supplier of last resort. So when they hear on the news that their supplier went bankrupt, they fear that they will lose access to energy. So it really is important, first of all, communication, that the energy supply will not be interrupted. And second of all, it's important also to avoid as much as possible supplier bankruptcies, because as Michael mentioned also, supply of last resort can be an expensive measure. And at the end of the day, it's going to be consumers or taxpayers who are going to pay for that measure. So the whole discussion on hedging requirements for capital requirements for suppliers, I think that's a discussion that we need to have, and we need to understand how we can approach the matter. Second point is about fixed price tariffs. It was mentioned by Bert. In many countries, fixed price tariffs disappeared or almost disappeared. And many consumers actually, have a preference for signing up for contracts for which, they know how much they are going to pay until the end of the contract. Here, the Commission in the paper they released in May, they put out this idea of a requirement for some suppliers to have fixed price tariffs always available. Again, it's something that I think it's worth investigating to ensure that consumers who have this preference for being hedged, actually they are hedged. And last point, which actually is the most important one, it's about consumer information. If there is one lesson learned from the crisis, which I'm not seeing in many places, actually, in many analyses, is that many consumers didn't know that the price they were going to pay for energy could even increase. And we've known that for years. We have, for example, our Norwegian member, the Norwegian Consumer Survey, Consumer Council, sorry, that every year publishes a survey on, trying to understand what is consumers' perception of energy markets and of electricity markets. And basically, half of the respondents every year regularly say that they don't know whether they are on a fixed price tariff or on a variable price tariff. And 25% they give random answers like I'm on a liquid tariff, stuff that it's not real. So what's important here, and I think that it's urgent that we have this conversation, also considering that the Commission is thinking about how to improve electricity market design, is this conversation about pre-contraction information. How do we make sure that suppliers provide information that it's helpful, clear to understand for our consumers? Because to our perspective, until now, they failed in doing so. And I will stop here, but again, happy to answer any questions and contribute to the debate.
Thank you, Jaime. Good point made about consumer awareness and information, whether it's about providing incentives for them to save energy, or giving them information about this, or on the contractual side. I think we can come back to this a bit later. So I'll just move on with the reactions now and ask of friends so Liam from the Northern Irish utility regulator to come in and also give your perspective on the study. Thank you.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. And the paper was great, very informative. I think my immediate reactions to reading it, one of the very first conclusion drawn about how there was a lack of preparedness on behalf of all stakeholders involved, consumers, regulators, and government, in terms of such a price shock that we're experiencing at the moment, and as well as the risks that are involved within the retail market. A line that stood out to me was on ensuring that suppliers don't fail, and how that reduces the need for consumer protection. Essentially, I would almost look at that as the ultimate consumer protection. Suppliers naturally may feel that the more a regulator steps in and is almost seen as intrusive, that they're going to resist that essentially. But I think not understanding the risks, not being prepared for those risks, it's led that it's part of why we're in the crisis that we're in. The lack of being ready for an increase in wholesale costs, that's something that through a lack of understanding of future risks that people haven't been prepared for, and therefore it's only contributed to the crisis rather than being ready for a crisis when it comes. But I think the other thing built into that is that through a greater understanding of risk, you can in turn have greater alignment between the thinking and the actual measures that are taken by regulators, by governments and suppliers and consumers. The lack of understanding and preparation for that risk means that it's resulted in types of ad hoc measures that are pointed out in the paper, and some people have been speaking about already here. With such a firefighting approach taken by governments at times, it may have short-term gains, but there's long-term consequences. And I think that you can see that in the case studies, for instance, in France, in terms of not being maybe prepared in the future for the energy transition itself. But those other measures that people have been talking about as well, in terms of like the energy efficiency measures people may need to adopt. You can't, until you have that alignment of thinking and coordination between the actions and regulators and government, it's going to be a lot more difficult to try and engage, with consumers to help them adopt energy efficiency measures or to integrate more renewables onto the electricity grid, for instance. The other thing that stood out as well is the deficit that, that anything that costs something today, if you don't pay for it today, you're still going to have to pay for it in the future. And once again, setting that in the context of a transition, which in itself is going to cost money, all these things just compound one another, and it's going to make that behavior change that we've been referencing a lot more difficult to achieve. What else have we written down here? Let's see. And the other thing, of course, that stood out was about imposing stricter requirements on the financial position of suppliers. So I've mentioned already briefly there about how suppliers may, you could imagine they would find that quite intrusive, and they're going to resist against it. But that, bringing it back to the first point I was making on ensuring suppliers not failing, is the ultimate protection essentially for consumers. That is protection for suppliers as well. Encouraging that long-term sustainability, that keeps them in the marketplace, and it's trying to upsell those benefits, I suppose, to suppliers that actually the regulator working with them to ensure their long-term sustainability is one of the reasons why you would want to understand those risks, costs, the impact of wholesale costs that I was explaining earlier. And that's myself essentially.
Thanks, Liam. I think all of your points clearly point towards the need for better long-term planning, scenario building, and be ready for the next time this happens. One good question is why we were caught so unprepared, and to start from this to be better prepared for the next shock, wherever it comes from. Thanks for that. Verdiana from Terna, maybe you want to come in with your perspective, maybe from an Italian perspective, or whatever point you'd like to focus on, please.
Yeah, good afternoon to everyone, first of all, and many thanks for the invitation to the presentation of the paper. I would like to share with you some few initial and general considerations from the side. I think one very interesting point that emerged from the paper, also thanks to the case studies considered, is how carefully the rules of a market have to be designed, taking into consideration the potential trade-off between the impact of such rule on the aspect it wants to address on one side and its potential impact on others aspect. And these taking into account the interaction between short-term intervention and long-term effect and perspective, and also taking into account interaction between the different segments of the market. I mean, it could be retail and wholesale, for example. And this is very important to avoid that the rules introduced, which was effectively introduced in order to address a specific goal negatively affect other desirable future of the market or other objectives, also long-term objectives. Therefore, I think it is important to take into consideration this when approaching an issue very complex like the one we are facing now with the current energy crisis. In the current context, one of the main goals is basically how to deal with the high and volatile prices, so to avoid or limit the extent to which consumers and industries are exposed to them and negatively impacted. On the other side, there are also other important priorities. One example is how to incentivize the demand to be more responsive to price variation, where the final goal here is to promote energy saving and flexibility development on the demand side, as someone already said. So I think in addition to consideration the market functioning itself, we have also to take into account the fundamentals of the market that have undoubtedly been changed and lead now to much different results than in the past. And as a consequence, this has changed the approach of stakeholders and institutions toward the market. So when looking for a solution, a potential solution to the current crisis or to the effect of the current crisis, it is important that any measure or solution that may be introduced is carefully assessed, so to avoid its potential negative impact on other desirable objective and future of the market. This, of course, without prejudice to the need to address somehow the high energy prices and the volatility in consideration of the potentially dramatic social and economic impact that they have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Verdiana. Very good point also about keeping the balance between short-term and long-term objectives, especially the changes that might be required over the long term, given the climate, Europe's climate goals. Moving to Greece now to get Leah's perspective. So Leah from PPC, maybe you want to come in and give us the Greek perspective on this.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation and the participation. I think I'll try to describe the retail electricity market in Greece, because I think can have an added value in all that dialogue and cooperation we have. Greece is experiencing the worst energy crisis since 1970s. Approximately 25 suppliers are active in the Greek retail electricity market, and PPC remains the dominant retail player, representing approximately 63% of the total consumption of electricity. Very recently, the Greek government has taken 4 short-term measures to reduce the cost of electricity, which I think are quite new in Europe, and maybe Greece can be included as a case study in that report. In particular, from July 2022, quite recently, a new temporary mechanism will be applied for 1 year until June 2023, which introduces a revenue cap in the day-ahead market of the energy exchange for generators per technology plant. Under that new mechanism, maximum regulated compensation prices for power generators are set per technology for the quantities of electricity they sell through the energy exchange. This means that generators will no longer be remunerated on the basis of the spot market, but will be remunerated on the basis of a fixed regulatory price. This price will be set on a monthly basis and will cover the cost of their plants and leave a reasonable margin of profit. The difference between this regulated cap and the spot price will be directed to the Energy Transition Fund. That is a special account which was established for the provision of subsidies to all energy consumers. And this new mechanism is not intervening in the electricity market, in the target model, which means that the spot price signal is still transparent. However, it contributes to the subsidies of all energy consumers. So we have to see how that it goes as a new measure. Probably, I think it's the first in Europe that will be applied, putting a regulatory cap to the revenues of the generators. Also, a second government measure that will also recently be applied is a one-off tax levy for a period of almost 9 months, from October 2021 to June 2022, to vertical integrated generators. That levy is referred to a revenue amount that will be taxed for producers, and that will be equal to 90% of their gross profits reserved by the price channel natural gas. And by that amount will be deducted the discounts made to companies to their customers, and refunds from any bilateral contracts, and losses also from fixed price contracts. The details of the second measure also are still pending, and we are expecting the relevant gazette by the minister. A third measure that the Greek government has set for transparency reasons in the retail market, and in order to enhance switching in the retail market in Greece, is that for consumption of electricity for the next year, starting from August, supplier will announce almost every 30 days a circulated fixed price contract, which is linked to the fluctuation of wholesale market sizes. And that fixed price contract will not have, will have only a total final price. And in the electricity bills, the consumers will only view a final price and will not see the index, the clause, and the variable part of that contract, so as to be much more confident to check the different prices within the market and to switch easily. And as a fourth measure, the government continues the income support subsidies in all electricity bills, both for electricity and natural gas consumption, regardless of voltage level. So these are the main government measures, short-term government measures, in order to reduce the increase in electricity bills. And within that environment, PPC tried to enhance its transformation plan. As a company, we focus on three main pillars: the transition to renewable sources and decarbonization. Greece is the fifth most coal-dependent country in Europe and has committed to one of the most aggressive phase-out plans in the continent. PPC has made a plan to shut down the thermal plants, the majority of the thermal plants up to 2025. So we try to focus on that plan. A second pillar that we focus is on our customers. We try to involve from an electricity provider to an energy advisor, because in that new environment, consumers have to be informed on a personalized basis, and we have to give emphasis on how to save energy. This is quite important, so as to cut the cost of the electricity. And also we try to focus on digitalization, and we are in the process of digitalizing our distribution network to make it more flexible and to be able to respond to new scenarios while we are modernizing our marketing. I think at the end of this report, the main, as the previous speaker said, the main scope is to balance the consumer incentives for energy efficiency and also the incentives for entrepreneurs to invest in renewables and so as to achieve the green energy transition. But the whole Europe tried to cope with. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Lots of actually interesting material for us to look into. Also, what's up? Interesting to see what's happening in Greece, and also good points still. So I think we will agree that it's important to find the right signals, whatever they are, to send to consumers. Not just within the context of the crisis, but of the energy transition in general. And so our last speaker is Andrea from Enel. I'm sure you have plenty of things to react to. That's the curse and also the good aspects of speaking last. Please, the floor is yours.
Always difficult to speak last, considering all the other speakers. But thank you very much for the study. I think that it's a valuable contribution because it recollects all the intervention that has been done by government companies in the last year, because the crisis is already 1 year old. And as we are seeing that the crisis is getting worse, is not getting better. So our way of solving the problem must also be step up. Why? If we look at the forward contract, for example, for France, for the month of December and January, yesterday they closed above 1,000 euros per megawatt hour. So it means that additional state resources or additional measure will need to be introduced in the wholesale, in the retail energy market, because it will be very, very difficult that our governments and will allow this kind of prices in the next few months, because they could break the social contract with our citizens. So we have to intervene in a forward way to try to avoid. It will be difficult because we have to try to avoid intervention that are hurried up and not think through. But for sure, we will need a complete rethinking of the current market design. And until today, we have thought about the retail market as the last part of the market design. Actually, it was not contemplated in the 2005 market design that we thought. It was left to national government to think through, and it was based only on short-term price signals. We thought that passing to final customer the price of the day-ahead market, it is something that could be useful, could be very good for customer. And we discovered that it's not like that. We have to think through how to introduce long-term price signals all along the value chain. So it's not a problem only for investor in new generation capacity, but is also there is also a need for long-term price signals to final customers. Until now, we didn't give a possibility to have long-term price signals for customers, and we didn't have long-term price signals for customers. If we think, for example, the regulated tariff in Italy, they are not allowed to, the regulated tariff is not allowed to buy long-term contracts to cover the needs for the regulated customer inside the market. And this is something that we are paying dearly, because all the customers that sign PPAs, for example, are getting the electricity at a a quarter of the price that is nowadays present in the market. So we have to rethink all of these if we want to avoid a complete crumbling of the internal energy market in the next few months.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you make a very good point about the fact that prices are bound to stay high, whether it's as part of external shocks or the European transition towards a net zero energy system. I'm going to ask you a second question right now. So when you speak about long-term price signals, so can you give us some more details on how you envision this maybe?
Long-term price signal can be quite different for different type of customers. In particular, we are thinking about 4 possibilities to introduce long-term price signal. The first one is the most simple one, PPAs, but PPAs are generally signed, so purchasing power agreements between generator and industrial customer. Generally are signed only by industrial customers, and so it's very difficult to introduce them for retail customers. In many states, we don't have the possibility to sell long-term prices to family, because generally they have the possibility to switch the customer after 1 or 2 years. So it's very difficult to introduce PPAs or some other forms of long-term contracts, like forward contracts or a fixed price for very, very long time. And when we are thinking about long-term price instrument, for sure we are considering PPAs, we are considering the forward markets, but also some form of long-term obligations on retailer to cover their sales toward final customers in a green and stable way.
Thanks a lot for the precision on the instruments. Before I ask some follow-up questions to the panel, there were some questions that I think were answered already, but I saw in the chat that, and I think that's a good transition to go back to the academic team. There was a question on among the case studies that we looked into, which ones are good examples as regards support for residential energy efficiency improvement, and why. I think Michael, you already addressed this question in written, but I don't think everybody can see it. So maybe it'd be good if you can, maybe reply to this one and maybe also react. And after you, Bert and Chloé, to some of the comments that were made by the speakers. Michael, do you want to give it a go first? And then we'll go back to the panel.
Okay. Yeah, great. So thanks for all the comments. Yeah, so Paul asked a question about, good examples of energy efficiency. And clearly one of the advantages of high prices is that it should incentivize energy efficiency. We know the long run effect of the 2 oil price shocks on European energy efficiency was enormous in the long run. And I think it is worrying not to pass the prices on to consumers. And that is clearly very short-sighted and, guaranteed to make the short-run crisis worse. Which some people have highlighted, especially if, we have genuine increasing supply crunch coming. The fact that European demand will scarcely respond to high increases in the wholesale prices is only going to make the next wholesale price spike worse. And of course, we haven't spoken about this. It's European industry that basically just has to shut down. That's all exposed to spot prices, that coming off any long-term contract hedges that they have, or if they have a contract hedge, better to sell the electricity than produce real output. So, we shouldn't forget that ignoring easy wins in the household market just makes things worse for European industry. And that's people's jobs that are affected, not just their household energy bills. So complete. I mean, I think one of the. Let me pick out 1 or 2 interesting comments, and other people can perhaps pick up on some of the others. Scilla was mentioning about the energy trilemma. I think this is a genuinely interesting test. That we've been saying this in theory, that energy prices have to go up to reflect carbon costs, and we have to, in a sense, move to a regime where the marginal price of energy might be high, but of course we have some cheap renewable energy. And this is an absolute sort of dry run of net zero and its impact on prices. And I think clearly it is an opportunity to put better long run price structures in place. And we hope to sort of think more clearly about that in future work. And certainly anybody's comments on that would be interesting. I think, Liam and Verdiana were mentioning, what's the right answer on risk? And I think what the case studies illustrate is, of course, countries and populations and electorates have different preferences for risk. Texas is not the same as France. Clearly the French have got very low preferences for risk, whereas some countries, Norway, the Norwegian case is really interesting. Prices are up by an order of magnitude. But maybe that's okay, maybe, or maybe there's more willingness to absorb volatility. And maybe you can get away with raise the price, offer a direct subsidy, whereas in other places, people have got more preferences about price volatility. And so I think getting that balance right is really difficult. And I don't think there are obvious answers to that, and I think the other thing to think about is you can't just leave it to the market. That is why we have regulators in energy. That's why we have financial regulation. And one of the reasons why you can't just leave it to suppliers to go bankrupt because they haven't hedged their positions properly is because people expect regulators to regulate suppliers. People don't have full information about what they're buying. And why would they? And there has to be a certain amount of regulatory protection combined with some exposure to caveat emptor and personal risk on the part of households. But again, that balance is going to vary from country to country, and getting it right is what we are seeing tested at the moment. But thank you, lots of really interesting comments, which we'll think carefully about. But perhaps some of my other colleagues have got comments they'd like to pick up on.
Thank you, Michael, and maybe also some people from the panel will have reactions to some of the points that you just made. Just raise your hand if you'd like to react to that. In the meantime, maybe Bert or Chloé, I don't know who wants to go first, if you also have further reactions to what's been said so far.
Yeah, Albert. So I think there were a lot of very interesting comments. So I think I agree with most of them. So I think that we actually might learn a lot from financial regulation and see what kind of lessons we can take there and that we might be able to apply to the electricity sector. One topic that was discussed is the role of consumers and whether consumers should be protected. And in the banking sector, we have sort of a duty of care where you only are going to offer contracts that fits the needs of the customer. And I could imagine that we also have something like that in the energy sector, where we have to see whether certain customers able to switch to a real-time price contract and that they understand that actually that prices can go up and that they have the financial means to deal with it. I think the second point that's also related with that is that there are trade-offs in the regulation. And there are good arguments for regulating the risk of the retailer. So there are certain market failures. Consumers don't have the knowledge. They don't have the economies of scale to monitor those retailers. And there are those negative spillovers from bankruptcies. And it also leads to government intervention. And that's similar in the banking sector. So there's really an economic argument for regulating risk. But we also have to think about the trade-offs that are there. So there's a trade-off between having small entrants, competition, new business models that are going to enter. And then there is another other side of it is stability and maybe vertical integrated large firm that are maybe better able to hedge their risk. And then we have to think about the benefits that competition might bring. So I think that this discussion, we haven't really looked that deep into it, but competition might actually lead to new business models or to new types of contracts where consumers are hedged in one way, but still have some flexibility or can sell some of the flexibility back to the network. And I'm not sure if we would have like the old regulated monopoly that this would come about. So I think that's important there. Also, competition might actually help in information provision. So I've seen in the Dutch market, many of the new entrants trying to offer contracts that are hedged or are linked, for instance, to the wind output, and they try to tell this to people with some graphs with flying leaves, trying to say, okay, if this is the type of thing you see outside, then you might get lower prices. So I think that's another thing that I would like to stress, that we have to think about what's the role of competition and what kind of benefits does it give, and how far do we want to sort of fix the business models in the market by too strict regulation, maybe.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much, Bert. Very good points. Chloé, with our transition, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you all for your comments. I think it's really interesting. There are definitely many trade-offs. I would like to mention 2 points maybe. There's definitely some decision on the short term, no? And for political reason, definitely France was also, I mean, the decision in France was also a political decision, and the idea that you want to protect the consumer now. And but I think it's also important that we think in terms of long-term decision, and this we can have a role also in what is the right signal. So when Andrea says that we need to have long-term price signal, that's also a problem. Which kind of price signal do we want? I mean, is there no uncertainty? So there's been, for example, in France, an interesting discussion in the gas market, because there will be no more regulated tariff in the retail sector in the gas market after July 2023. And some people have been argued that that will be the best, and then to some sense to allow for demand response, and then competition will be free, and there will be no advantage for the incumbent. But however, there's some people also saying that the regulated tariff could be used as a reference point price for contract, even for alternative suppliers. So if this regulated tariff disappear, then you will have no obvious reference price for the consumer. And then of course we can agree that we could provide other type of information, but at least this one is, it's also an interesting element if we think about making sure that the consumer has a sense of what's going on in the market.
Thank you very much, Chloé. I'm going to go back to people with questions. Andrea, you wanted to quickly come in. I see you've got your hand up. Do you want to react to some?
Yes, one point on this, and I think it's very important on how we construct the regulated tariff. So it's not only that we need or we don't need a regulated market if liberalization should deliver the enough result, but in the moment that we are discussing on regulated tariff, we have to discuss on how these regulated tariffs are constructed. We had some example that have brought bad consequences. For example, a regulated tariff in Spain that is totally connected to hourly prices has created the condition for an intervention by the government that has brought some issues on the integration of the internal energy market, and they created internal subsidies between different customers. So I think it's very, very important to consider how do we build them? How do we build regulated tariff if they are day ahead, intraday, they are short term, they allow a fixed price for the next 5 years, they are fully based on renewable energy sources. There is a particular strategy behind how do we subscribe to this survey, because until this moment, everybody thought that the day-ahead market was the savior and was giving the signal for everything. We have seen that energy savings in the electricity sector with these high prices and high intervention of the member state has been not so strong. We have not seen a big 20, 30, 40% of reduction of gas consumption or of electricity consumption. But it's something like that we would have expected at this kind of prices, but it's something that is not happening, in part because all the residential customer has been bailed out by the state, even the customer that they were able to pay these high prices, but also because sometimes maybe very short-term energy prices are not the perfect solution for the retail market of the future.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. And yeah, we go back to the tough question of demand response and carrying on price signals to consumers. I think Jaume can testify to this. I see you've got your hand raised, so I'll let you come in now. I guess it's on a related issue.
Yes, no, I wanted to comment actually on both points that were raised by Andrea. First one on regulated prices, and I mean, totally agree that it's important. Not only the question whether we should have regulated prices or not, but also where we set the where we set the price actually, and of course, I mean, important that they are set not below market costs, because I mean otherwise someone would need to pay for the tariff deficit. But on regulated prices, actually, my reflection is a bit different, meaning that so with the electricity directive, for example, but also with the gas directive now, basically there is this idea of phasing out regulated prices when we're going to have at some point in which we're going to have sufficient competition. The question they have is, now that we're seeing many suppliers exiting markets, is would regulated prices be important again, at least to set a benchmark? I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't necessarily have the answer, though. I think that's a question that we need to ask ourselves. And on demand response and on basically reacting to high prices in general, I think that it's the problem is that consumers don't necessarily react to price signals unless they have the equipment that allows them to react to price signals. Example, smart charging of electric vehicle. If I have a smart charging point, it's actually quite easy. But I don't know, modulating the demand of my heat pump to wholesale prices. If today I had prices, if I don't have a smart thermostat, it's a bit of a nightmare. So important is to provide consumers the equipment that they would need to be able to react to the price signals, otherwise they will not react. And important is also the information. So explaining them that there is this, that this equipment exists, that it allows them to engage in markets, to engage with energy in a different way that they were engaging before, and these will bring them some monetary savings. I mean, at the end of the day, we really need to break it down, to consumers in a way that they can really understand, because at the end of the day, the job of a household is not to be an energy expert. The job of a household is to have another job and to run the family, for example, and yeah, I mean, have a different job. So I mean, this is only a part-time job that should occupy very little of their time.
Thanks a lot, Jaume. And indeed, I mean, the consumers need to have the right tools, and I mean, we're far from having everything in place at the moment. So one of the big questions is how to actually ensure sufficient demand response for next winter, right? So over the short term, what's actually doable, and that's actually a question that I would direct to Anne from DGNR, and also Xilat from Acer. Maybe you have. Based on the work that's been done already at Acer and DGNR, what can be done really over the short term, basically within the next 6 to 9 months, especially to control household consumption. Anne, do you wanna Do you mind answering this question first, and then I can go to Xila?
Yeah, sure. I think that this question is rather part of a larger debate, which is how to reform the way the electricity market works and how to create those incentives for consumer to react. So rather than part of a short-term measure addressing the crisis right now, I mean, it can be part of a short-term measure, but we're really looking at it from a long-term perspective as well. Because we believe that it's important that the consumer actively participate to the market as well. With this respect, the European Council has tasked the European Commission to look into the long-term adjustment to the functioning of the electricity market. This is very early stage right now because we are starting this work now, and we intend to conduct a full impact assessment of all options to improve the functioning of the electricity market. And we will probably build on the ESA report that has been published earlier, but we will also build on a large public consultation that will take place in the autumn this year.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Xila, do you want to go next?
It's a very good question. What you can do, like in the short run for the next winter, and probably which I think appeared also in other regulatory discussions. It's very important, the role of information, and eventually to show households how they could save energy through simple measures, tools. And the temperature reduction of thermostats and similar kinds. The real problem with this, because I think these ideas appeared already early spring, is how the consumers react to it and how seriously they take this. I think this is the challenge. This is where you have to kind of send the message differently. And what we see at this point that governments are very careful and sending responses via prices. I think there's also another challenge to understand where is really sort of the benchmark for vulnerability and energy poverty. I mean, there we probably will have to have a better understanding, what is kind of, supported and taken care of, protected, and which is the part which where we would like to see eventually savings and demand reduction. I really like what Michael said that savings would be important also on the front of the households, because eventually that would ease the situation for the industry to maintain presence. And also there are industrial segments which are also very important for reasons of like the food chain, the public health. So you have aspects and services which you need to sort of keep and sort of to function or to operate, even if you are faced with crisis. So this is a very big dilemma. I think what we see very positive is the storing. So gas storages are being filled up. So there we could have sort of some sort of a buffer. The question is what is happening though in terms of reductions, because dependency on gas in certain countries and dependency on the Russian pipeline supplies are really high. So how the gas market will keep kind of alive the very tight balance in which is found today, and then what kind of repercussions that would have on then more broadly the energy sector.
Thank you very much, Xila. Very interesting. We're nearly out of time, so I'm unfortunately not going to be able to take more questions. But what I'll do instead is I'll give very briefly the floor back to Michael. Maybe if you want to say a few parting words before I do and close this session. But thanks a lot, everyone, for a very engaging session. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks, Alberic, and thanks everyone. Some great comments there, and look forward to taking them forward. I mean, I can't resist saying a couple of things about a long run perspective on this. Long-term prices do matter. I mean, remember Denmark. Denmark has I don't know whether it still has a 100% tax on electricity, very high electricity prices, and that does generate over the long run in conjunction with other energy efficiency policies, much lower energy consumption. And a characteristic of developing countries with respect to energy is being stuck in a short-run equilibrium where prices are below cost. You know, think of India, for instance. So we don't in Europe want to be stuck in the short run of, you know, subsidized permanently energy prices. We want to get into this sort of long run state where we have, you know, we are generating incentives to be energy efficient and, you know, behave sensibly. And, you know, I think there must be a role for better coordination across Europe, that we need a coordinated increase in prices and, you know, resist the temptation to subsidize energy prices heavily and to not get the demand response that we're clearly going to need. You know, I think a challenge to the Commission to be policing what's going on in individual countries more carefully. But thank you for all the comments that we've had.
All right, I guess that concludes us for today. So thanks very much again to all of the presenters, speakers, and the audience. So as discussed before, so the next, so first, this paper is available online on our website. So, you know, please download and read it. It's not that long, and it's a good read. And yeah, so the next installment in this series will be a paper and another workshop on wholesale aspects, on which much of the debate has focused on over the past 6 months. So we'll be back with that in September. And until then, wishing you all a very good summer. I think only a few days left for most of us before we take some time off. And I'll be happy to see you all after that. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Good afternoon.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.